So this is a pretty simple example, but this is Machu Picchu. And you notice that there are two different styles of construction. The smaller stones on top with mortar, and then big stones that interlock below it. And so some people would say, well, that's the foundation, so obviously bigger stones were used. But the Inca had no ability of shaping granite, which is 7 out of 10 in hardness, when their tools were 3.5 out of 10 in hardness. Physically, it's impossible. Your tool has to be harder than the material you're cutting. And this is also at Machu Picchu. And again, you notice the megalithic stones on the bottom, and then smaller stones on top. And the important thing when you go to these sites is you say, has this been reconstructed? And the guards there know, and they say, no, no, this hasn't been reconstructed. We found it like that. And we removed some of the plants and stuff, but this is Inca. And then you go, thank you, and walk away. And you'll notice the gaps that are in between. We found out, because we had geologists with us, that, and other scientific experts, they said that could only have been done by an earthquake of about 9 point something, because it pulled all of the structures apart a little bit, and all from east to west. So there was some kind of force went from east to west through all of the megalithic sites in Peru and Bolivia. So that again is something that most people wouldn't even look at. They'd go, oh, big stone, smaller stone. So we do know, of course, about the myth of the flood, but it's not only in the Bible. There are more than 200 cultures from around the world talk about the same thing, how their world was flooded, whether their world was an island or a continent. But it's the same story. You know, this massive thing came from almost nowhere, and few people survived because there was no way to predict it was coming. So the Bible, of course, is the obvious example of that. And what we know now through science is that something came into our solar system from outside and wreaked havoc. And the timeline we have is about 12,000 years ago. So some say it's a comet, some say it's energy from galactic center, etc. So I looked at all of the theories. And this does coincide with Plato's Atlantis, because Plato's Atlantis supposedly sank 11,700 years ago. And the only thing he got wrong, because he was using third-hand information, was that the Atlantis didn't sink, the sea level rose and sank the landmass. But poetically you would say the continent sank. And then you ask a geologist, can a continent sink? And they go, no. But if the water rises, then that's poetically describing a sinking continent. And at the same time, about 12,000 years ago, all of a sudden, the woolly mammoths basically disappeared. And especially the famous story of all the ones that were found in Siberia, and they were flash frozen because they found them with buttercups and other food in their mouths. So all of a sudden, something happened to the climate. And probably what happened is that this is when our planet went from being perfectly vertical to suddenly 23.5 degrees. Something hammered the Earth and shifted it almost instantaneously. And these guys were actually wandering around in a temperate environment, and the next minute they're in the Arctic, and they all die off. And that's also, so this is the beginning to be the theory, is that our axis shift happened the last time, 12,500 years ago, and that would have completely wreaked havoc on the planet. If you were living in the jungle, the next day you're living in a temperate climate, and so all the plants die off because they can't survive. And then if you're living in a temperate, all of a sudden you're in the Arctic, and then the reverse. So that's the theory we're working on, and there are a lot of indigenous stories that say way back in time there were only 2 seasons. And that makes sense if the planet is vertical. You know, and of course you ask the indigenous people, when was this? And they, I don't know, a long time ago. And there are also indigenous people who say there was the day that the sky fell, because one night they're looking up the sky and the constellations are where they understood they were to be, and the next night they were different. So they didn't notice, but the Earth had shifted.
Wouldn't that mean that the pyramids
That's a problem. We'll get into that.
They're still facing perfectly north now.
I know, that is a problem.
You have other structures that are 23 degrees off.
Yeah, I know. Well, it's much more complex. Like a situation like that makes it more complex.
Yeah.
So you can't necessarily say pre-flood, post-flood.
I thought the timeline was 75,000.
Well, according to what the experts have told me, it's 12,000. But there are other ones before that. It could be every half precession, which is 13,000 years, or maybe every precession, which is 26,000 years. Something happens. It's a recurring cycle of the planet getting hammered by stuff. But the same thing happened with what are called the megafauna. Supposedly Native Americans crossed the Bering Land Bridge and just wiped them all out. But it makes more sense that there was a massive climate shift that caused them to die out, like what happened with the dinosaurs millions of years ago. So there's this couple of scientists, Allen and Dallaire, believe that 11,500 years ago, they came up with a theory called cataclysm, where basically a comet or parts of a comet either hit the Earth or came so close that there was this series of cataclysmic events that happened. And I think they wrote this in the 1950s and were attacked by academics. And then Barbara Hand Cloud took up this idea, and she's actually a professional astrologer, so she added astrology into it. And her belief is that not only did this happen, but what was also created in the minds of the humans that survived was what she called catastrophobia, in that this was so devastating that those that survived the cataclysm then sought refuge wherever they could, and this was the beginning of the so-called caveman period, because you had to go underground or into the earth somewhere to survive, because these series of events didn't happen just in one moment or one day. Supposedly it kept going on for 200 to 300 years. And then Dr. Paul Laviolette, who's an American physicist, thinks that galactic center is not a black hole, but it's a pulsar. So every 13,000 years it absorbs the energy and light, and then it fills, and then it erupts it back out again. And then that energy travels across the galactic plane with gamma rays and all sorts of things, and again wreaks havoc because it goes straight through stuff. So that could have been what caused the asteroid belt. You know, originally it would have been a planet, but it got blasted because it was one of the first ones to be impacted by this energy field. And then also I think the planet Uranus is rotating on its side, whereas it should, everything should be perfectly aligned and harmonious the way it was created. And I believe Venus is rotating backwards, and then it went, according to his theory, it went right through the sun and then pushed plasma out, and then the plasma hit different sites on the Earth, not the whole Earth, but certain spots. Like we see vitrification of stone in Scotland and Peru and Egypt recently. And so if that had happened, the plasma would be several thousands of degrees hitting these sites and these areas, and it would have vaporized everything in the area. So melting the surface of the stone, but vaporizing any people or any plants. And that means nobody could go back there for thousands of years, because there's nothing there. And we see a lot of evidence of that, especially at Karnak in Egypt. And then Robert Schoch, and his idea is the same, that the planet, or the sun has a cycle of 13,000 years where then it starts to erupt or shoot plasma in different directions. And one of these happened, I think, 3 years ago. And it went the distance from the sun to the Earth, but luckily it shot it the opposite direction. So if that had come our way, that would have been big problems. So what I did is I looked at all of their stuff, and I thought, well, what aspects of what they're talking about is logical? And I took pieces of each of their story and interwove it all together in my book, because people have a tendency of saying, this is my theory, and you know, this is my theory, and only my theory works, and that's not my mentality. It's like, well, what part of what you're saying is logical, and what part of it are you kind of adding on to that doesn't make sense? And so that's how I came up with my my theory on it. And of course we have the concept of Atlantis. So again, it's probable because 12,000 years ago the level of the world ocean was about 300 feet lower than it is now, that there could have been a civilization which comes to us as Atlantis, but then the sea level rose because of this cataclysmic series of events that caused a large mass of the North Pole to melt very fast. And actually not melt, but vaporize. If it was hit by the solar plasma, it wouldn't melt. It would go into the atmosphere, supersaturate the atmosphere, and then come down. And Robert Schoch, in a private conversation, and he's a major geologist, he believes that took place in 2 weeks, the rising of the sea level. And that's based on more and more data. So what that would do is, of course, ancient civilizations living on any coast are gone, you know, within 2 weeks. Either you leave or you're dead. And so that's why certain areas of the continental shelf in certain parts of the world are off limits for study. Like the south coast of India, you're not allowed to go because they have found cities underwater, but the government doesn't want anybody tinkering. The same thing in the Mediterranean. Graham Hancock wrote a book called Underworld, and in one case he went to India. He paid for all of the permissions to rent the boat and get the scuba diving equipment and do this, and he'd laid out a lot of money, and the day that he was to go out and go diving, the government came and took away his permit. You know, like, oh well, that cost you $50,000, too bad. No, and we won't be giving you another one. And the same thing happened in the Mediterranean. He wanted to dive off of Egypt, and the same thing happened. He'd rented the boat, the equipment, etc., and the officials came just before he launched and said, give us this certificate back. There will be no refund. So this is what has hampered people like Graham Hancock and others, like in the 1980s, 1990s. But luckily all this stuff, I'm lucky in that I've only been doing it for about 10 years and everything's starting to fall apart naturally anyway. So that's why when the Osiris shaft was opened, it's not a question of should we, it's like we're going. Because they could seal it up the next day and never open it up again. So you go in there with a 4K video camera and you film everything you possibly can, so you have the data, you know, to be used by whoever wants to use it. So if these series of events did happen, then all that we have left are stone structures. Everything else has been vaporized. And if a high percentage of the population has disappeared, it's likely that most of the knowledge has disappeared because those who could read or do any of this work are probably gone. And you're left with those who have a memory but no capability of using the information even if they were presented again. So this is an example. This is Cusco in Peru, and this is the classic Graham Hancock. You can't fit a credit card or a piece of paper in the joint. You can't fit a human hair. Like, there is no space. And if you see that tiny little ridge there, there are like hundreds if not thousands of those little tiny movements upwards, and that makes the wall 10 to 100 times more difficult to make. Because it's easier to just put a layer on top of a layer. All you need is a string, and you mark it, and you put one on top of the other. You make every surface flat. But whoever did this said, no, I want to interlock each one of these stones together. And that's very, very difficult. And this, again, is basalt stone, and the quarry is 50 miles away. And it's estimated that the original Cusco that was found by the Inca was a city in ruins, and whoever had built it had almost exclusively built it from basalt, from this quarry 50 miles away, and there has to be at least 100 million, or let's be conservative, 100,000 tons of stone that was moved from that quarry. That wasn't people carrying, you know, or putting them on llamas. A llama can carry 50 pounds. A strong man can carry any distance, maybe 100, but we're talking megalithic sized blocks. And no trees, before the time of the Spanish, there are no trees that grow in Cusco that grow straight. They all grow like that. So there's nothing to use as rollers. And 6 months of the year it rains. So how are you going to move it across a mountainous terrain like that?